Okay. That's a little intro from one of our loves. And halfway through 11. That's so real. Yep, chapter 11. The 4 processes of grieving. Grieving is at its most effective when the survivor can grieve in 4 ways: angering, crying, verbal ventilation, and feeling. 1. Angering. Diminishes fear and shame. Angering is the grieving technique of aggressively complaining about current or past losses and injustices. Survivors need to anger, sometimes rage, about the intimidation, humiliation, and neglect that was passed off to them as nurturance in their childhoods. As they become adept at grieving, their anger out of their healthy resentment at their family's pervasive lack of safety. They become incensed about the 10,000 betrayals of never being helped in times of need. They feel rage that there was never anyone to go to for guidance or protection. They bellow that there was no one to appeal to for fairness or appreciative recognition of their developmental achievements. My first book, The Tao of Fully Feeling, Harvesting Forgiveness Out of Blame, explicates in great detail a safe process for angering out childhood pain in a way that does not hurt the survivor or anyone else. In most cases, survivors do not have to directly anger at and blame their living parents. The key place to direct it is at your internalized parents, the parents of your past. The most common exception to this occurs when a parent is still abusive. This and other exceptions are explored in depth in my first book. Angering is therapeutic when the survivor rails against the childhood trauma, and especially when he rails against its living continuance in the self-hate process of the critic. Angrily saying no or shut up to the critic, the deputy of his parents, externalizes his anger. It stops him from turning this anger against himself and allows him to revive the lost instinct of defending himself against unjust attack. Additionally, angering rescues the survivor from toxic shame. It rescues him from blindly letting his parents' venomous blame turn into shame. Angering redirects blame back to where it belongs. It also augments his motivation to keep fighting to establish internal boundaries against the critic. Angering can be done alone or in the presence of a validating witness. Distracting kitty. Such as a trusted friend or a therapist. Over time, the vast majority of angering needs to be done silently in the privacy of your own psyche. This is the anger-empowered thought-stopping of shielding yourself from inner critic attacks. Many survivors are so identified with the critic that it becomes their whole identity. Such survivors typically need to focus on fighting off the critic until they have established the healthy ego functioning of self-protection. Angering also serves to rescue a person from the childlike sense of powerlessness that she is flashing back to. It reminds her that she inhabits an adult body with which she can now defend herself. Through all these functions, angering serves to reduce or antidote fear. It reawakens and nurtures the instinct of self-preservation. With practice, it increasingly builds a sense of both outer and inner boundaries. These boundaries increasingly move us out of harm's way. They offer safety from the bullying of others and safety from the most damaging bully of all, the inner critic. Finally, angering can also empower the myriad thought corrections and substitutions needed to establish the survivor's belief in her own essential goodness and in the lovability of discriminately chosen others. Angering bolsters her from the long-term gradual process of wresting her self-image away from the critic and re-educating the psyche to make it both user and intimacy friendly. Angering helps deconstruct repetition compulsions. Survivors need to resuscitate this instinctual anger about parental maltreatment, or they risk blindly accepting others' reenactment of these behaviors. A meek, visible, fearful client of mine suffered devastatingly sexual seductions by trusted male figures on 3 occasions in her adult life. Over time, we traced these back to a childhood betrayal by a trusted uncle, the only seemingly kind caretaker of her childhood. She was emotionally abandoned by her parents, and he preyed upon her loneliness. He gradually took appropriate physical affection, one increment at a time, into contact with that became increasingly sexual. My client was helpless to her uncle because her ability to say no was parentally extinguished by the time she was in preschool. The ability to say no is the backbone of our instinct of self-protection. Consequently, she is unable to protest his sexual violations. On subsequent occasions in her life, a minister, a doctor, and then a therapist exploited her via a reenactment of this original scenario. She was so lost in flashback all 3 times that she did not protest their exploitive betrayals. He could only react to the situations later by turning her anger inward and blaming and shaming herself for not stopping it. Eventually, during our work together, she was able to engage in the angering process of grieving. After about 6 months of my witness, validating her anger at her various perpetrators, she became in 1 week glowing with pride. She welled with tears of joy and relief as she described her success in stopping an office predator who was in the early stages of similar seduction. This was the stage of seemingly friendly touching, but unwanted pats on the back gradually escalated into mild sexual innuendo, lingering touches on her hand and then her forearm. These were the first inappropriate advances that she had never been able to protest with her previous abuser. She was thrilled, in awe of herself, that she was able to say, in the presence of another worker no less, "Please don't touch me. I don't like it when you touch me, and I don't want you to touch me anymore." The seduction was immediately terminated. Success. 2. Crying. The penultimate soothing. In grieving, crying is the yin complementary process to the yang process of angering. When we are hurt, we instinctively feel sad as well as mad. The newborn child, hurt by the loss of the perfect security of the womb, howls an angry cry. Crying is also an irreplaceable tool for cutting off the critic's emotional fuel supply. Tears can release fear before it devolves into frightened and frightening thinking. In fact, crying is sometimes the only process that will resolve a flashback. Months, my entire winter, was genuinely sobbing. I really didn't think anyone could cry that much. Meow. The newborn child, hurt by the loss of the perfect security of the womb, howls an angry cry. Crying is also an irreplaceable tool for cutting off the critic's emotional fuel supply. Tears can release fear before it devolves into frightened and frightening thinking. In fact, crying is sometimes the only process that will resolve a flashback. I have witnessed my own critic wither into innocuousness hundreds of times after a good cry. On thousands of other occasions, I have seen my client dissolve their fear, shame, and self-abandonment with the solvent of their tears. I have also seen them then surface into a healthily angry place, determined to confront a current unfairness that they now find unacceptable. A client who left a year-long therapy to move elsewhere recently wrote to me about an experience she had with crying. She was hospitalized with a terrible stomach pain and soon learned that she had cancer. She had wisely cut off contact with her toxic family, but was all alone in her new living situation. She was beside herself with fear and felt that she was on the verge of nervous breakdown. She wrote, "I know you think that all that talking you did to me about crying didn't get through. So did I, in fact. But at the moment I was feeling the most hopeless. Some of your words came back to me, and a rainstorm of tears fell out of me. It scared me at first, but I soon started feeling this amazing sense of relief, and that I would be okay if I let them operate on me. It's now 12 months since then, and many tears later, not to mention a bit of barking at God. And I seem to be well and truly in the clear." Here's another testimony of the powers of tears. It is excerpted from an email of a male client who wrote to me 6 months after we finished a year-long course of therapy. "I think it's the tears. Crying so much of late. You were right. It's great. I love it. Tears of sadness, tears at the beauty in the world, tears of grief and loss, and tears of gratitude that my life is finally becoming manageable and even intimate. I've cried more in the past couple months than I have done in the past couple of decades. I'm actually opening up to life. It's become less narrow. It's not just pain, shame, guilt. There's something else, something quite beautiful. An additional benefit of crying is that unabashed tears simulate the relaxation response of the parasympathetic nervous system. This counterbalances the excessive sympathetic nervous system hyperarousal we experience in flashbacks. As we learn to grieve effectively, we allow ourselves to mourn about the lack of positive parental attention in our childhoods. We feel sorrow about the horrible reality that parental attention was typically negative and dangerous. As recovering progresses, we also cry for the child who was not appreciated and reflected as special, worthy, and easy to love. Crying and self-compassion. When we greet our own tears with self-acceptance, crying awakens our developmentally arrested instinct of self-compassion. Once we establish self-compassion through consistent and repeated practice, it becomes the cornerstone of an increasing sense of self-esteem. When an attitude of self-compassion becomes habitual, it can instantly antidote the self-abandonment that so characterizes a flashback. Moreover, self-compassion creates a foundation from which we can build authentic, intimacy-enhancing compassion for others. The depth of our ability to be there for an intimate generally depends on the depth of our capacity to practice unwavering allegiance to ourselves. Crying and angering in concert. I wonder what that is. Crying and angering are the two key emotional tools for releasing the pain of the abandonment. Typically, we need both processes to attain full release. Crying and angering together differ from whining. Whining is a type of emoting that gives grieving a bad name. Whining is a delicate subject because many people who complain and/or cry in a healthy manner are pathologized as whiners. Dysfunctional whining, however, is often an unhealthy mixture of angering and crying, where either anger or sadness is repressed but leaks through in a grating manner. Here are two great examples of this. When a hurt person only knows how to express anger, His repressed sadness unconsciously seeps into his anger in a way that makes him sound like a martyr or someone with delusions of persecution. Because there is no substantial release of his sadness, no amount of whining brings him relief, and he can angrily whine endlessly in a way that exhausts his listener's empathy. Similarly, when a hurt person is only able to cry, repressed anger tinges her sadness and makes it sound like irritable and interminable belly aching. One of the clients calls this anger coming through a very small hole. Many of us suffer from a socialization process that relegates anger to men and crying to women. From an early age, boys are shamed for crying while girls are treated similarly for angering. Hence, boys become men who can only vent their emotional pain through anger. Sadness then must morph into an irritable mood, aggravated whining, or angry catharsis. Similarly, some women unconsciously try to squeeze their anger out by whining or crying in a way that devolves into feeling stuck in helplessness and self-pity. Many men also rely on anger to carry all of their emotional expression. They get mad when they are scared, humiliated, or feel down. Many women, on the other hand, can only try to cry out these feelings. This typically results in a very incomplete release. The full motion of emotion is arrested. Half of the normal emotional release process is then stymied in each gender. Without complete emoting of his hurt, a survivor can become stuck in moodiness. His unexpressed emotions deteriorates into a stagnant and lingering mood. His moodiness can range from festering resentment to a shame-tainted self-pity that is anything but self-compassion. Blocked anger can degenerate into bitter sullenness, and blocked sadness can deteriorate into melancholic self-indulgence. How this contrasts with the healthy grieving of my 6-year-old son, who has to periodically grieve the loss of his narcissistic entitlement. Less and less does he get to be what Freud calls His Majesty the baby. As his previous apt entitlement lessens, he mildly bawls at new rules that are age appropriate for him to learn. Bawling is the evolution of the baby's angry cry, and it releases pain through angry crying. He howled a bit this afternoon about the unfairness of having to do his homework after school before he could play somewhere. As we climbed the 37 stairs to our home, he punctuated his crying with a flurry of anger condemnations. I don't like you, Daddy. You're not fair. I'm not going to be your friend. I'm grateful for this healthy grieving, and I still am somewhat amazed that I can so calmly hold it as I help him metabolize this latest loss of early childhood narcissistic privilege. By the time we get to the top of the stairs, he opens the door and genuinely peals out a guileless laugh. Daddy, look, Pikachu fell off the table. Daddy, can we play Pokemon after I practice writing letters? Grieving was almost instantly delivered him from painful loss into eager apprehension of what is fun about life and what there is to look forward to. How frequently I see my clients reemerge into remembering their real present-day resourcefulness once they have grieved through a painful flashback. When we can both anger and cry while re-experiencing our early abandonment in a flashback, we can obtain a more complete release from the abandonment melange. Each survivor does well to assess whether his angering or crying is blocked or stultified, and to then work at recovering it. There are, of course, numerous men and women who are reverse examples of the gender polarization mentioned above, and everything in between. Moreover, there are many survivors in whom both anger and crying are blocked. They also benefit inordinately from rescuing the healing balm of both anger and tears from the stultifying prohibitions of the critic. If you are unable to cry or feel angry, focus on your breath may help you to emote. This is especially true if you attend to the sensations in your abdominal region as it expands and contracts during respiration. Deep, slow, and rhythmic breathing stretches and expands various visceral muscles and internal organs in a way that sometimes brings feelings into awareness. If this does not help, holotropic rebirthing and Reichian therapy employ special breathing techniques to help free stuck emotions. I know many survivors who first reclaim their capacity to emote through these techniques. 3. Verbal ventilation, the golden path to intimacy. Joy shared is doubled. Sorrow shared is halved. Old Chinese saying. Verbal ventilation is the third process of grieving. It is the penultimate resolver of emotional flashbacks. Verbal ventilation is speaking or writing in a manner that airs out and releases painful feelings. When we let our words spring from what we feel, language is imbued with emotion, and pain can be released through what we say, think, or write. As our grieving proficiency increases, we can verbally ventilate about our losses using shame-dissolving language to tell the story of how we were unfairly deprived of our birthright to be welcomed into a family that cherished us. My favorite technique to enhance verbal ventilation is to encourage the survivor to talk in an uncensored manner about whatever comes to mind while he focuses on his feelings. If his feelings are not in awareness, focusing on bodily sensations can provide rich grist for verbally ventilating. Verbal ventilation is therapeutic to the degree that a person's words are colored by the descriptive of the anger, sadness, fear, shame, and/or depression she feels. Ventilation that is liberally punctuated with actual crying or angering is especially powerful. Theoretical neuroscience on verbal ventilation. Verbal ventilation is a tool that can remediate brain changes that are caused by CPTSD. Susan Vaughn, MRI research demonstrates that emotional flashbacks overactivate the emotionally oriented right brain and underactivate the thinking-oriented left brain. With this hemispheric polarization, there is an overwhelming reemergence of childhood pain that is emotionally remembered by the memory-oriented right brain. At the same time, the survivor loses access to the higher functions of her left brain. This temporary loss of cognitive perspective explains why it is so hard for a survivor to realize that she is only flashing back and not really lost in danger, helplessness, and hopelessness of the past. Verbal ventilation is, at its most potent, is a therapeutic process of bringing left brain cognition to intense right brain emotional activation. It fosters the recovery's abilities to put words to feelings, and ultimately to accurately interpret and communicate about his various feeling states. When this process is repeated sufficiently, new neural pathways grow that allow the left and right brain to work together so that the person can actually think and feel at the same time. The corpus callosum is the part of the brain that connects the left and right hemispheres. Research shows that the corpus callosum is smaller in some CPTSD survivors. Further research shows that the brain can generate new neurons and new neuronal connections to remedy this situation, thinking and feeling simultaneously. When a survivor becomes proficient at verbally ventilating, she heals a crucial developmental arrest. She learns to think about feeling states in a way that creates healthy, helpful, and appropriate responses to feelings. These responses are characteristically respectful to her and to whomever she is with. In his book, Emotional Intelligence, Daniel Goleman writes that this is a core trait of emotional intelligence. With continued practice, verbal ventilation coordinates the left and right hemisphere of the brain so that whenever the right brain is hyperactivated in flashback, the left brain is also fully engaged. This also can be seen in an MRI. With the left brain back online, The survivor can remember to use the flashback management steps to successfully help manage a flashback. As with angering and crying, verbal ventilation is only effective when it is liberated from the critic's control. In early recovery, verbal ventilation can easily shift into verbal self-flagellation. Verbally ventilating from the self-attacking or drasticizing perspective of the critic is rarely effective grieving. Instead, it typically triggers or intensifies flashbacks, which in turn frequently generates self- and intimacy-injuring behavior. Many survivors in the early recovery are unable to notice their unconscious shifts into over-identifying with the critic's point of view. When this is the case, they usually need the help of therapists or sufficiently recovered intimate to help them recognize and neutralize the critic. Verbal ventilation is an especially transformative grieving process. It not only promotes the same type of fear releasing and shame dissolution as angering and crying, but also helps to expose the manifold guises of the critic's self-attack and fear arousal programs. Verbal ventilation also helps us to identify and communicate about needs that have long been unmet of our childhood abandonment. Verbally ventilating alone. Verbally ventilating alone, where no one else can hear you, is a helpful therapeutic technique. Untraumatized children do it frequently in their play, much to their great benefit. If your room is not private, you can drive your car to somewhere that is. Typically, it takes considerable silencing of the critic to regain this therapeutic tool. This tool is so powerful and restorative that it is worth many skirmishes with the critic to reclaim it for your CPTSD toolbox. One of my clients kept an 18-inch length of rubber hose and a phone book in the passenger seat of his car during the year that she was doing the lion's share of her anger work. She would hit the hose loudly on the phone book whenever her brainwashing, abusive father came into her mind. She would, of course, pull over for this, and found over time that she could do it inconspicuously in places with surprisingly limited privacy. It was remarkable to me how much critic shrinking she did in that year. Disassociation deadens verbal ventilation. It is important to differentiate verbal ventilation from dissociative flights of fantasy and obsessive bouts of productive worrying. Disassociation is a defense that children develop to distract and protect themselves from the overwhelming pain of their abandonment. As unsupported children, we have to disassociate because we are not able to effectively grieve. We have to protect ourselves by not allowing the full brunt of our pain into awareness. As we saw in Chapter 6, there are two common types of disassociation: right brain disassociation and left brain disassociation. Right brain disassociation can be seen as a classical disassociation, as the defense most common to freeze types. If the right brain process of numbing out against intense feelings or incessant inner critic attacks, disassociation is once again a process of distraction. Survivors commonly experience it as getting lost in fantasy, fogginess, TV, tiredness, or sleep. Verbally reporting from a place of self-distraction is in fact the opposite of verbal ventilation. Getting lost in daydream-like descriptions of improbable salvation fantasies is a common way that clients avoid their pain in a therapy session. Another common example is recounting long, elaborate dreams that are devoid of emotional content or serious attempts at introspection. Earlier in my career, I worked briefly with a freeze-type client who was stuck in an avoidance process of endlessly monologuing about her dreams. Dina recalls them in lifeless, excruciating detail. In fact, her deadened delivery was emblematic of the way she talked about most everything. Dina was an intern therapist who locked up her vulnerability with the belief that dream work was the piece de resistance of therapy. My attempts to guide her into exploring her deep underlying experiences were routinely met with the heckles of her fight response. I was unfortunately not experienced enough at the time to help her see that this was dissociative defense that she had constructed as a child to protect herself from a very intrusive mother. Sadly, she left therapy disgruntled and still trapped in the isolation that was born of alienating others with her distant, abstract, and non-interactive dissertations. Left brain dissociation. Left brain dissociation is obsessiveness. Commonly, this ranges in severity from dwelling on a singular worry to repetitively cycling through a list of worries, to panicky drasticization and catastrophizing. This type of disassociation from internal pain strands the survivor in a helpful rumination about issues that are unrelated or minimally related to the true nature of her suffering. This is an example of this. Your friend complains incessantly about the bad weather or the unfairness of people who do not use their turn signals. He cannot stop grumbling because no amount of complaining about the wrong thing releases the pain that is driving his obsessive grievance. If he were able to look deeper at what is really troubling him, he might learn that his wife's constructive feedback is continuously flashing him back into the fear and shame he felt when his mother verbally abused him. Left brain disassociation can also be a process of trivialization. This occurs when the survivor overfocuses on superficial external concerns to distract himself from upsetting inner experience. Becoming overly preoccupied with sports statistics or the lives of Hollywood celebrities are common examples of this. This is not, of course, to say that such interests are not worthwhile when they are pursued with moderation. Finally, left brain disassociation can also be seen in intellectualization. This is what the novelist Ian McEwan called the high-walled fortress of focused thinking. Some survivors overly rely on reasoning and lofty dialogue to protect themselves from the potentially messy and painful world of feelings. Even the highest level of critical thinking can deteriorate into an obsessive defense when they are excessively engaged. Verbal ventilation heals abandonment. When we share what is emotionally important to us, we learn to connect with others in a meaningful and healing way. This applies to sharing concerns that excite and please us, as well as those that frighten or depress us. Perhaps there was no more detrimental consequence of our childhood abandonment than being forced to habitually hide our authentic selves. Many of us come out of childhood believing that we have to say as uninteresting to others as it was to our parents. We must repudiate this damaging legacy of the past. Verbal ventilation is the key way that people make friends. It parallels the way tender touch, soothing voice, and welcoming facial expressions help infants and toddlers establish bonding and attachment. When we practice the emotional-based communication of verbal ventilation in a safe environment, we repair the damage of not having had this need met in childhood. This in turn opens up the possibility of finally attaining the verbal, emotional intimacy that is an essential lifelong need for all human beings. Committing to this type of practice typically requires courage and perseverance. Authentic sharing can be triggering and sometimes flashes the survivor back to being punished or rejected for being vulnerable. Therapy, individual or group, can help greatly to overcome and work through these obstacles to vitalizing your self-expression. Verbal ventilation and intimacy reciprocal verbal ventilation is the highway to intimacy in adult relationships. Sufficient practice with a safe enough other brings genuine experiences of comforting and restorative connection. For me and many of my clients, such experiences are more alleviating of loneliness than we had ever thought possible. Nowhere is this truer than with mutual commiseration. Mutual commiseration is the process in which two intimates are reciprocally sympathetic to each other's troubles and difficulties. It is the deepest, most intimate channel to intimacy, profounder than sex. Mutual commiseration also typically promotes a spontaneous opening into many levels of lighthearted and spontaneous connecting. As deep and meaningful connection with another becomes more available and frequent, the survivor increasingly experiences the shrinking of his abandonment depression. I must reiterate here that some popular bodywork approaches to trauma belittle the usefulness of talk therapy. While somatic work is a vital tool of recovery, it alone cannot shrink the toxic critic or resuscitate your self-expression. Cognitive work, especially that which is empowered by verbal ventilation, is fundamental to CPTSD recovery. With that said, we will move on to feeling, the fourth grieving process, a process that is a type of bodywork. Feeling is a way of focusing on somatic experience that enables us to reclaim our ability to experience full, relaxed, and vital inhabitancy of our bodies. 4. Feeling. Passively working through grief. Feeling is the antithesis of pain. The more pain one feels, the less pain one suffers. Ongoing engagement in the active grieving process of angering, crying, and verbal ventilation can help us to discover the fourth grieving process, feeling. Feeling is a subtler, passive process than emoting. It is best illustrated by contrasting the concept of emoting and feeling. Emoting is when we cry, anger out, or verbally ventilate the energy of an inner emotional experience. Feeling, on the other hand, is the inactive process of staying present to internal emotional experience without reacting. In recovery, then, feeling is surrendering to our internal experiences of pain without judging or resisting them, and without emoting them out. Feeling is a kinesthetic rather than cognitive experience. It is the process of shifting the focus of our awareness off to thinking and into our effects, energetic states, and sensations. It is the proverbial getting out of your head, or getting into your body. As a grieving process, feeling involves consciously reversing the learned survival mechanism of clamping down on pain to banish it from awareness. That's exhausting. Feeling occurs when we direct our attention to an emotionally or physically painful state and surrender to this experience without resistance. When we relax acceptingly into our pain, we can learn to gently absorb it into our experience. Feeling then functions as if our awareness is a solvent that dissolves and metabolizes the effect, energy, and sensation of our emotions. Feeling can heal digestive problems. The practice of feeling is also similar to healthy food digestion, whereby a relaxed digestive tract allows us to effectively assimilate nutrients. If, however, we suppress or repress our feelings, our bodies typically armor and tighten, especially along the alimentary canal. I believe digestive tract tightening can create the types of digestive problems that frequently occur with CPTSD. Diarrhea, for instance, is sometimes an emotionally caused physical response to intense danger. When this occurs, fear triggers the sympathetic nervous system into further triggering an immediate evacuation of the bowels. Nausea can operate similarly. Constipation, on the other hand, is sometimes a tightening in the alimentary canal that hampers the peristaltic motion necessary for healthy evacuation. You wanna come on? Come on. Come on. Come on, honey. Jump up. Come on. Smusher. This is Clee. My roommate. They got a bit of a little kitty wheeze, a little kitty cold. Amen. Nausea can operate similarly. Constipation, on the other hand, is sometimes a tightening in the alimentary canal that hampers the peristaltic motion necessary for healthy evacuation. The emotional physical connection. There is often a close relationship between emotional and physical sensation. Physical sensation in the body often occurs with feelings. Moreover, sensations of tightness and tension can develop as a defense against feelings. As unexpressed feelings accumulate, a greater degree of muscular tension is necessary to keep them under wraps. A child who is repeatedly punished for emoting learns to be afraid of inner emotional experience and tightens or armors the musculature of her body in an effort to hold feelings in and to banish them from awareness. Holding your breath is a further manifestation of armoring. It is an especially common way of keeping feelings at bay, as breathing naturally brings your awareness down to the level of feeling. As my client Kylie Free associated on the feelings of particularly intense flashback, she painfully recalled the trauma she underwent trying to avoid her mother's punishment for crying. Her worst memory was the day in the supermarket when her mother's scolding rained down upon her as she tried to suppress her rapidly mounting urge to cry. Knowing the worst punishment would ensue if she cried, she held her breath to hold back the tears. She held it so long that she fainted from a lack of oxygen and cracked her head open on the floor. Her mother, mortified by what she saw as public humiliation, beat her black and blue when she got home. It took us 2 years of trust-building work to bring this incident back into awareness. She then cried her first tears when it happened 3 decades earlier. These were also the first tears she could ever remember that brought relief. The technique of focusing your awareness on physical sensations in your body can help you to become more proficient at the practice of feeling. With enough practice, paying attention to the tightness in your face, throat, heart, or belly area brings feelings into awareness, where they can simply be felt through. However, in your earlier experiences of focusing on sensations, feelings may come up so strongly that you will benefit from allowing yourself to emote them. Balancing feeling and emoting. When we become more mindful of the subtlest sensations of feelings, the passive grieving process of feeling through them complements the active process of grieving them out. We are typically in advanced recovery when we can both emote out and feel through our anger, sadness, fear, shame, and depression. Furthermore, feeling also helps us to bring emotions into awareness that need to be grieved out through active cathartic emoting. Thus, grieving is especially profound when we can fluidly shift between feeling and emoting. Sometimes we only need to fully feel and accept the sensations of our pain. Other times we will want to verbally ventilate our pain out with someone who gives us full permission to color our words with anger and tears. Learning to feel. As the survivor becomes more adept at angering and crying, fear of his feelings will decrease and opportunities to learn to simply feel will present themselves. He can engage these opportunities by passively attuning to the more subtle sensations of his anger and sadness. Over time, this practice will build his ability to stay passively present to the sensations of his deeper feeling. To his fear, shame, and depression. But in early stages, this awareness will often morph into the need to actively emote them out, to grieve himself out of the abandonment melange. Eventually, however, his abandonment melange feelings will also be digested and worked through purely with the solvent of awareness. This also applies to the anxiety, which is often fear just below the level of awareness. With sufficient practice, anxiety can often be felt through passively. We'll explore this process in greater depth in the next chapter. An exercise in feeling. Here is an exercise to help you enhance your ability to feel and grieve through pain. Visualize yourself as time traveling back to a place in the past when you felt especially abandoned. See your adult self taking your abandoned child onto your lap and comforting her in various painful emotional states or situations. You can comfort her, him verbally. I feel such sorrow that you were so abandoned and that you felt so alone so much of the time. I love you even more when you are stuck in this abandonment pain, especially because you have endured it for so long with no one to comfort you. That shouldn't have happened to you. It shouldn't happen to any child. Let me comfort and hold you. You don't have to rush to get over it. It is not your fault. You didn't cause it and you're not to blame. You don't have to do anything. Just let me hold you. Take your time. I love you always and care about you no matter what. I highly recommend practicing this even if it feels inauthentic and even if it requires a great deal of fending off your critic. Keep practicing and eventually you will have a genuine experience of feeling self-compassion for the traumatized child you were. When that occurs, you will know that your recovery work has reached a deeper level. Techniques to invite and enhance grieving. Tears were hard to come by at first. After my first breakthrough cry in early adulthood, I would often long for the incredible relief I felt on that occasion. But unlike angering, I could not force my crying. I have come to learn that this is typical of many people. My friend Malcolm, suffering the same frustration, wanted to cry so badly that he squeezed lemon juice into his eyes. He was able to laugh about it later, but solemnly warned me never to try such a thing. This is a list that evolved out of our ongoing discussions about how to coax out the tears of a good cry. As with all the evidence in this book, please feel free to use only the ones that seem to fit, in whatever order seems best. Moreover, different combinations may enhance either crying or angering or both together. Finally, sometimes nothing works, but I encourage you to try techniques that intuitively seem like they may work more than once. 1. Find a safe and comfortable place where you won't be heard. 2. Close your eyes and remember a time when you felt compassionate towards someone. This can be from real life or from reading a book or a poem, or from watching a movie or moving news items. 3. Invoke self-compassion via the memory of someone who was kind to you, or imagine someone you think would be kind to you. I would be kind to you. 4. Verbally ventilate about what is bothering you in a journal or aloud to a real or imagined friend or to me. 5. Imagine yourself being comforted by a higher power. See yourself in the lap of a kind of higher power or actual person who seems kind. 6. Remembering a time when you felt better from crying or angering or seeing someone else cry in real life or in a movie. 7. Remembering